Well, it's 7 o'clock, so good evening. This is the kitchen in San Francisco and Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, California, live online, and I'm delighted to welcome you. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this evening by my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Noah Kushner, who is going to be sharing with us this evening a conversation all about our previous conversations about Jewish Life Awakens. And I'm really delighted that you're here, Noah. Thank you for joining me tonight.
This series of conversations we had was one of the most meaningful things over the past few months. So it's really my honor, my pleasure.
Really, I'm so glad you're here. I'm just going to mess with the video just a little bit so that we get the right people on. And I promise you, everybody else, you'll get to be on in just a few minutes as soon as we get started. So thank you. So we started this project back in the fall. I think it was even before the election, before the upheavals, before the insurrections, before all of the so many issues that have become part of our culture. And we started asking a very important, what I think is a very important question. And the question we wanted to explore together was what's happening in Jewish life at the moment? And is Jewish life, not just the ostensible question of is there a future, which is something that Jews always want to talk about, because Jews, I have discovered in my career as a leader in the community, you know this as well. Jews are addicted to crisis. We thrive on crisis, which means we thrive on pessimism. We thrive on disaster. You tell a Jew good morning, and he wants to know what's behind that. Every silver lining has to have a cloud. It was the great Abba Eban who once said that Jewish people are the only people in the world who refuse to take yes for an answer. I mean, we just have this tremendous sense that crisis, catastrophe, disaster is just around the corner. And when you show up and you say something with the least amount of optimism, right away you're accused of being naive and unrealistic. But the problem is, number one, that's not empirically right. That's not empirically supported as a description of the condition of the Jewish people. And number two, that if the narrative of the community, and it certainly was the narrative that I grew up with, if the narrative of the community is that we are disappearing, that we haven't a future, that we are going to acculturate and become simply a non-entity, a non-part of American culture, but world culture, then there's absolutely nobody who's going to make sacrifices to join us, and there's no one who's going to devote their creative energies to sustain us, and there's no one who's going to step forward to lead us. And so it's critically important for us to change that narrative and to see us not as a people who is disappearing, but as a people that goes through moments of, it's a sort of cycle. There are moments when Jewish life waxes and moments of Jewish life wanes. And what we're seeing in the community now is a remarkable upheaval, a surge of creativity, a surge of new ideas, of entrepreneurship, a surge of new leadership in the community. It's going to be very different than the community of our ancestors, but it's something optimistic and something quite creative and powerful. And so Rabbi Kushner and I decided to take off on a little journey and to go and visit with some friends. Some people that Rabbi Kushner knew, some people that I knew, some people that neither one of us knew, but we took a lark and sent an email. And nobody said no. Everyone said they'd be delighted to be part of the series. And through about 10 conversations, we met some of these remarkable creative souls who were imagining a new way of doing Jewish in America and in Israel, a new way of thinking about the Jewish world, a new way of thinking about our lives together as a community. And that's been this wonderful journey. And I have to say that on the one side, you saw that we recorded these over time and then broadcast them somewhat later. So we were not concerned with responding to Inyana de Yoma, to the big events of the day. And there were big events of the day. There was an election, there was an inauguration, there was an insurrection, there was an impeachment. Big events of the day, Rabbi Sachs, Lord Sachs, alav shalom, passed away. Big events of the day. We didn't respond to those. And in some ways, I felt badly that we didn't. But on the other hand, I'm sort of glad we didn't, because I'm going to sort of concentrate on what we wanted to talk about, which is a bigger time frame. And the bigger time frame is this, the time frame of where we are in Jewish history in the broad sense and where we're going. So I welcome everyone who's listening tonight. I welcome everybody who's here on the Zoom and everybody who's watching on Facebook and on YouTube. I'm delighted you're with us. We're going to have a chance to have a conversation with everybody in a few moments. But I want to begin, if I could, without playing interviewer, just to ask Rabbi Kushner, of the talks that we heard, of the people that we met, of the journey that we took together, what are you left with? What impressed you in this, and what touched you?
These were profound conversations, but there's one comment that changed the way that I think, and I even put it in a drasha a couple of weeks ago, and it not so much changed the way I think, but it recentered something. And actually, to your point, I feel like in different eras, we have different things that are in play. Right. So after the Shoah, of course, there's a lot of big questions about God. You know, is there a God? How could God do this? Right. And I'm interested that in our moment, I think many of the questions have to do with who's the we at the table. You know, in the religious map, who are we? Not even who do we serve, which was another great question of another time, but who is the we? And who is this God that we're relating to? What is this about? And so I think a lot about Dr. Malila Hellner, actually, because I'm very interested in activism and in connecting heaven and earth and connecting the words of Torah to the words of the street. And so I knew she was an activist, and I know she's a Kabbalist, she's a mystic. So at one point, at least in my memory, I asked her sort of innocently, so how do you take the Kabbalah? How do you take mysticism and apply it to the street? How does it give you koach? How does it give you strength? And she very, very gently says, oh, no, you have it all backwards. We're not trying to end up on the street. We're trying to end up in heaven. And if we lose sight of which way the trajectory is going, we're lost. And in that moment, she puts God back in the middle. And I think what I heard from some of our scholars, Rabbi Tamar, was this idea of helping people to fall in love with God again and putting God back into the center. And who is the we that will be part of that project? So, you know, that's very broad strokes. And there was so much that I pulled from the different conversations, but that comes to mind. How about you? Was there one comment that stood out for you, or one person?
Well, it wasn't, there are many of the comments, but what stood out to me most of all was the sort of emotional quality of this. I was raised with the narrative of the disappearing Jewish people. That was the narrative that I grew up with. I remember being in USY when I was a high school kid, that there was a program we had to do, like at every kinus, at every program, we would sit in a circle with a candle in the middle, and there was a reading. It was this mimeographed reading that was passed around called The Last American Jew. And somebody would read it dramatically. And it was a story of a guy sitting in a display case in the Smithsonian Institute. I think the year he identified was actually 2014. And he talked about how piece by piece, every element of Jewish identification in North America and in Israel sort of sort of dissipated and dissolved. And everyone gave up their attachment to things Jewish. And in the end, he's the only one left. And here he sits in a museum exhibit, just sort of as an exhibit to an extinct culture. And we would read this thing, and it would be, we would all get teary-eyed, and we would all promise that we'll not let this happen, and which meant we would come to shul and we would date only Jews and we would eat only kosher, and that was the world I grew up in. That was the narrative I grew up with. And the fear factor, as it were, the fear that induced in the community, it means a fear of letting go of what was, kept us from grasping on what ought to have been. But what was so wonderful about these conversations is that each and every one of the people we spoke to, from the very youngest to the very oldest, the Yitz, who was this wonderful philosopher, who's in his 90s already. Each one of them had this tremendous sense of what's coming is exciting, that what's coming is not a threat, that what's coming is not a loss, that it's not that we're diluting or diluting Jewish culture, but instead we're developing the next steps in the life of this wonderful people. And that each of them gave testimony to something that I've believed in for a long time, but really was reinforced in this experience, which is that there is, in fact, at the core, the soul of the Jewish people, a tremendous resilience, a cultural resilience, and a spiritual creativity that when it finds soil, when it finds fertile place and fertile soil, it flowers. It doesn't disappear. And that even though we've never dealt with the conditions of modernity, the conditions of free choice, the conditions of voluntary religion, the conditions of freedom and acceptance that America has offered, even though, and certainly we have no experience, at least for 1800 years, with sovereignty as we do in Israel, that this moment is an auspicious moment, not a destructive moment. It's a moment of real optimism and possibility. And that gave me tremendous sense of joy. I went back and listened again to our conversation with Tamara Elad Applebaum, who talks to us. The first thing she said to us is, I don't want to talk to you as a rabbi. I want to talk to you as a mother. And she said, I'm a mother. These are my kids. This is my family. I'm going to shepherd this family. But I have fear for my family, of course, because I want to wrap my arms around them and protect them. But at the same time, I know I have to let them grow. I have to let this thing develop and flower. And it was a tremendous, outside of the ideologies and outside of the concepts and outside of the programs that people develop, there was that emotional confidence in the spiritual resilience of the Jewish people, gave me tremendous hope, a tremendous experience. So what next? So among them, who surprised you the most, or which one had you not known that gave you a sense of, wow, look at that?
I've studied with Dr. Aviva Zornberg for decades. And she really is, out of all the people we spoke with, she really is my teacher. I've been very lucky to study with her in person many times. And, if you saw my books, they're like torn to shreds. But I've never heard her speak as comprehensively and autobiographically. And in fact, she even wrote me afterwards and was like, did I reveal too much? And of course she taught straight Torah for 50 minutes and spoke about herself for 10, right? But she's very modest and a very humble person. And it wasn't even that she talked about her life, although it's extraordinary. Her father is the chief rabbi of Scotland, and she learns Torah at his knee every day growing up. But, for people who are familiar with her work, she's exploring, she's taking great risks with her Torah. She's not interested in finding pat answers. She's looking actually for the cracks. And she's okay with things that are quite unresolved, revealing things that are quite unresolved. And I think if there was a person who didn't have a strong bedrock of, and I'm not saying it's constant, but she has a faith. Her father, she talked about how her father gave her a faith. And I think because of that, it allows her to make these really interesting and brave intellectual forays into places that maybe some of us would be afraid to go. But because she can return, it's all of a piece. And so to hear her talk about that and to say, no, actually, faith doesn't go with dogmatism. Faith actually can go with a great intellectual risk-taking. And I'd never heard her pair it in that way. And that was also profound for me.
And I was touched by B'nai Lappi, who is a rabbi, somebody I taught actually, who came to Chicago and built a yeshiva. But it was a yeshiva for queer folks. That was the language she used. And we asked her why. And the statement was so powerful. Again, the emotionality of it was every bit as powerful as the concept. To give Torah to the people, to open Torah up. and not just to open the books to those who had never had a chance to study them, but to open those souls up so that they could share their Torah with the rest of the Jewish people. That gay, lesbian, LGBTQ people have not just have been excluded, but their voices have been excluded, and their perspectives on Torah, because they understand what it's like to be a pariah, to be on the margin, to be peripheral, to not be accepted, to be locked out. They have a unique and powerful vision of what Torah teaches as the Torah of the periphery, as the Torah of the margins, and to bring that into a sort of mainstream so that all of us can hear that Torah. Those people can encounter the books and then reteach them to the rest of us. That was a tremendous insight, a tremendously powerful and remarkable insight. And I really enjoyed that one. I really enjoyed that one.
Going back to this idea of who is the we? If you have the same Torah and the same God and the same four walls, but the we changes, that Torah changes and that God changes and everything changes. But I think to your earlier point, it doesn't have to change from a place that creates this great anxiety or fear. It could be this like delightful change. I never saw it that way. And actually, now that you see it, now that you say that, B'nai, I see that in me. And I never had permission to say that for myself before. And sort of this expansive moment.
And then, of course, anytime you can sit with Yitz Greenberg, it's worth doing, because Yitz is Yitz. Because Yitz Greenberg is how do you say, who is he? He's a patriarch of the community. His vision, he's lived through so much of the history of the community, and through its most remarkable and most tragic moments, and speaks a Torah of life. I mean, for him, he gives us a comprehensive understanding of Torah, that Torah is the battle of life against death, and that explains everything in Torah for him. And it comes back to that again and again and again. And he's fighting for that idea. I've heard him give that talk in many different contexts, because I'm a chassid of his. But to hear him, just with us, it was very sweet. And to hear him, the joy was he's in his apartment, or his grandchild's apartment, in Jerusalem, and the grandkid or the great grandkid keeps running into the room and jumping on his lap. And so you really have the sense of the power of his conviction that we are in the world to defend life against this encroachment of death. And that's the purpose of Jewish life. That's the mission of the Jewish people. And he has that remarkable sense that this, more than anything else, is what we're here to do. And I just find that it's so compelling. It's such a powerful vision, powerful voice.
And especially as we're coming up on Purim, right? And he talks about a God that isn't a supernatural God, like the God in the book of Esther. And that we're, literally our hands are the hands of God. And he's talking about doctors. And I don't know if this made it onto the tape, but, someone knocked on his door in the middle and he says, "Oh, great." And he looked at us and he says, "I have antibodies." Apparently someone was in my house with corona, but he's completely sanguine about it, and I've rarely been around someone who embodied their Torah so fully. When you talk about life and you talk about his grandchild, you felt that Torah in going through every bit, every motion of his. And I think the idea that he's a bridge from the Shoah to now is a compelling one. I really felt him being that bridge, that many of the ideas we take for granted are the ones that he has taught us.
And then on the other side, I mean, maybe the other end of the spectrum, as it were, if Yitz was the senior member of our cohort, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who is in some ways probably the youngest one we talked to, and the utter Mesiras Nefesh is the Hebrew word. Self-sacrifice is too radical a phrase. Mesiras Nefesh means to devote oneself completely to something, to give up oneself. And here she has given her whole life to this idea that we are in the world to fight for life, as Yitz would say, and to fight for justice, as the prophet would say. and her profound expectation of um, a Jewish community that would embrace a prophetic ethic and fight for those who are marginalized and peripheral and powerless and voiceless. And her remarkable sense, I think that the best part of it was this sense of like, what else could you be doing? What else are we supposed to be doing in the world? We kept asking her, like, why do you do this? And she's like, what else would you want to do? What else would you want to devote your life to? What else should the Jewish people be devoted its life to? And you hear in her, and then of course you hear as another echo of the same idea in Roly Matalon's embrace of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the combination of Heschel's spirituality, his profound sense that he lives with God, and his social justice, that this is why we're in the world, this is what God put us here to do, and this is what's expected of us. These are people who live Torah, and that's what it gives you tremendous hope that there's such remarkably creative, energetic, and brilliant people who are just living this Torah.
Yes, and going back to Rabbi Tamar for a minute too, she has this sense that God loves her, and she has to accept that and figure out how to serve with the gift of her life. How to respond in turn. And it's very much connected to Heschel, right? She says, even with my mistakes, all my mistakes, I have to figure out why God still loves me. And I have to respond in some kind of a way. And so you see it playing out personally. You see it playing out through prayer. Of course, Rolly's work with spirituality and Putim. And then you see it playing out on the streets. You see it playing out with people, with Jews on the front lines, who, by the way, Rabbi Jacobs takes a lot of hits. She doesn't just stand in the front when it's convenient. She stands in front even when it's controversial, because I think for her, it's actually an impossibility that's not the holy thing to do. There's no, as you say, there's no choice in the matter. But I think it's very much, again, connected to divinity.
And one of the things that struck me, I went back this afternoon and looked back over some of our guests, and listened to some of the interviews again, or just pieces of the interviews. And one of the things that struck me was, had we done this program a generation ago, how different it would have been, how different the faces would have been. And then the same question going forward, if we were to do this again, God willing, we should unite again 20 years from now and do this again. And what would the faces look like? I mean, the greatest teacher of Bible in the whole Jewish world is a woman, Aviva Zornberg, right? B'nai Lappi, who runs a yeshiva for queer people, is something that my Zayda would never have understood. Roly Matalon. I mean, each of these people it's such an interesting collection of souls, of personalities. And what would it have been a generation ago? Would it have looked very different? And what will it look a generation from now? I mean, there are people we didn't get to include, and we'll do this again in 20 years, I think, God willing, before that maybe. But Jews of color, people who had come to the Jewish people as adults, Jews by choice, and other kinds of identities which we didn't get a chance to explore, that we really should explore in another iteration of this same conversation. Well, go ahead, please.
I was actually just going to ask you, out of curiosity, what surprised you the most as you look at this picture? Did it confirm things that you already were feeling, or is there something in this moment, and even leaving Corona aside, what's surprising you?
In this moment?
Mm-hmm.
I've come in my old age to abandon the narrative of my youth, to abandon, and really not to abandon it, to resent it. Because the narrative of a disappearing people that placed so much pressure on us and brought such anxiety to Jewish life, I don't think was good for us. It didn't allow for the creativity and the openness and the experimentation and the innovation that we really needed. We were conserving, holding on, protecting, keeping, grasping, instead of really opening our hands and our hearts and truly exploring what this might mean, asking the right kinds of questions. It took a generation to let go of that narrative, and to gain enough confidence to be able to say it's time, to really find what's possible in Jewish life, and to celebrate what's possible in Jewish life. And the whole series that we did together, all these conversations have confirmed with me that that's where we really need to be right now. That's where we need to be right now. And now I understand. I mean, I understand why that narrative was so powerful when it was, and what use it played for that generation. I mean, Heschel gave a wonderful talk in 1964. He was invited to the GA, and he said to the GA, to the great assembly of all of the Jewish federations at the time, he said, there's two words I want to remove from our vocabulary: surveys and survival. He says, surveys, we don't need any more statistics, and survival isn't why we're alive. Survival is something an animal struggles for, but a human soul struggles for something bigger than survival. And he wanted the Jewish people to understand that's what we're in the world for. And these conversations really confirmed that for me.
Amen. Amen.
Well, I want to give all of our guests tonight a chance to join the conversation. So I really, I'm so grateful that you've sat so quietly listening to us schmooze here. So here's how we're going to do this. If you'd like to, you can either hit the raise hand function and I'll call on you and you can unmute. You can actually turn on your video if you'd like, or if you'd like to ask me a question in the chat box, I'd be glad to answer. I'd be glad to share with Rabbi Noah, and we can talk about this together. And those of you who are watching on Facebook, I have it open. So if you want to hit me with a comment question in the comment box, I'll be glad to answer a question together with Rabbi Noah, or let her answer the question together with me. And we can do this together if anyone would like to share. So either in the chat or by raising your hand, I can see you. So I want to make sure that everyone, we wanted to do this live tonight so you'd have a chance to join the conversation, but I think I've muted you all and you've all fallen asleep. Of course, I'm a congregational rabbi and I'm really used to people sleeping in my presence. So Doug Workman, where are you?
I'm here.
So turn on your video. Yeah, I can hear you, and I can't see you, but I can hear you.
It says you cannot turn on the video because your host has stopped it.
All right. So I'll turn it on. There you go. Don't be so pushy about it. Listen, when does a rabbi ever get to make a congregant disappear? This is one of my deepest fantasies. So you have to just indulge me, Douglas, please. And I love you, so I wouldn't do this except in this format. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
My question had to do with Yitz. I adore the man, and the man's thinking is so innovative and bright and brilliant. And then I scratch my head and go, he's an outlier in his own community. Why does his own community fail to accept him?
That's true.
Yeah, that's actually very true.
Am I inaccurate in that description?
No, he is an outlier in his community, and he's an outlier in his community, for lots of reasons. But for one thing, because he is open to a variety of different ways of understanding Jewish life that his community hasn't yet come to accept. And because of that, he doesn't find an acceptance in his own community. His own community is very insular. The Orthodox community is, with some exceptions, and there's some serious exceptions to that. I don't want to paint everybody, but large parts of the Orthodox community wants to maintain their own way of life and don't want to be contaminated by exposure to life outside of it. And so they remain an insular community. It's a beautiful community, by the way. It's an ethical community. It's a supportive community. It has its own poetry, its own remarkable support, but it's not a community that, with some exceptions, that has a great deal of truck with the outside community. And Yitz has been one who stepped out of it and said, it's my job to bring the lessons of Torah to Jews who are not religious like I am. And there are many in that community who just don't see that as their mission. They don't see that as their mission. So That's one of the reasons. Well, I think one of the reasons he has, and then the other kinds of reasons he has is because if you read his theology, it's fairly radical. I mean, the idea that that God has handed over responsibility for the fate of the world to us, and that God is no longer intervening in human affairs the way that God might have done in previous generations, and we are the place, the locus of divinity. We are the place where God lives in our own responsibility. That's something that largely in the Orthodox world is an idea that's kind of radical. Noah, you want to add anything to that?
Just that when I hear him speak about his theology, to your point, I'm fourth generation Reform, and now I probably am in the post-denominational camp, or, I like to say I like all the denominations, but it sounds like classic Reform theology, sort of take God and bring it into the world. And I also think he has a great comfort with speaking with a wide variety of people. And I wonder if, I couldn't point to examples, but my sense is the Orthodox world has changed a great deal in the past 40, 50 years. And I think he has had direct and indirect impact on the opening up of that. And, seminaries that ordain women in the Orthodox world. I'm sure he's not directly related to it, but I'm sure his leadership was a great part of that.
When he was a scholar in residence at VBS, his wife, Blue, in talking about law, used this statement: where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. And that, I don't think his community has figured that out yet.
Well, again, because if that's the way that you're thinking, what you're saying is that there's an independent sense of morality, or rather a sense of morality that's independent of my halacha. And I bring that sense of morality to bear on my halacha, and I measure halacha by my morality and not the other way around. And that's something that his community is terrified of. Because once you allow people to think that way, to have that kind of freedom of conscience, then you're going to have a whole lot of people starting to chip away at some of the structures of halacha. And that's not just Yitz, of course. Avi Weiss is another Orthodox rabbi, very important Orthodox rabbi, who is also an outcast in that community. The whole the yeshiva that Avi started, is also, and the rabbis that they're ordaining now, women rabbis. So there's a great deal of pluralism within Orthodoxy, great deal of turmoil within Orthodoxy, and that's where Yitz lives, in that turmoil, and that's what he reflects. Lois Weinsoff, you get the next question. If you'll unmute and you can actually
unmuted, but you have to let me do my video.
I can let you now. Do it. You can try it now. See if it works. No.
It says that the host has stopped it, and never mind.
All right.
Well,
I'm trying to do it.
I'll ask my question.
Please.
I want to challenge you, Eddie, on your statements about when you were a kid and the disappearing Jewish community, and just tell you that when I look to my family, both sides, there were only two of us who raised a Jewish child. I was one of them, and another cousin, and my grandson is the only Jewish grandson, or the only Jewish kid on both sides all the way. So
Yeah.
How was that you were hearing in the 60s, I guess, so wrong? And are these people that you brought to the table, are they not outliers?
Yeah, they may be. So there's two things. First of all, I love your grandson, by the way. You know that. So
And
if he's the only one in the family,
you can have him on the screen next
I love
time.
It. I think he's a very special young man.
Jody Kustanovich calls him the mayor of Valley Shalom.
We love him. He's part of us. Look, first of all, the numbers are debatable. So, the Pew study comes out and says that, 94% of American Jews are proud to be Jewish, even though 20% of them say they're not Jewish, by religion at least. The numbers are really kind of mixed up and debatable. And without a doubt, there'll be fewer Jews in the next generation. And without a doubt, not just fewer Jews, but as the population grows and our numbers diminish, we'll have a smaller population relative to the larger population. So that's without a doubt, right? But now the question then is the following then. What narrative do you embrace? And if you want to see Jewish life survive, and if you want to see Jewish life thrive, what narrative you embrace as a governing narrative? If you embrace the narrative that we're a disappearing people and we have to hold fast to everything that we do and not let anything change, because anything changes constitutes a dilution of the purity of Jewish commitment, you're going to die in a generation. The generations of the Jewish people that have thrived in Jewish history are the generations that did what the guests that Noah and I interviewed have done, which is see where we are culturally and then move forward and say that what was isn't what necessarily needs to be, and that what got us here is not going to get us there. And we have to have permission to be creative, to be experimental, to be innovative. We have to have the permission to move forward into a new era of Jewish life. And that's what I learned from these people. Now, whether I can't predict to you we're going to have, a thriving Jewish community. It's going to be different. It's going to look different. Institutions are going to change. That was one of the things Yehuda Kurtzer pointed out to us with, how many institutions have changed even in the last 10 years. But what is remarkable is that there's so much life in this people. It's not behaving like a dying people. It's behaving like a people awakening again. There's new life, there's new prayer, there's new learning, there's new initiatives in social justice. It's a remarkable thing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to tell a self-serving story, which is,
please.
When we started the kitchen, everyone said you can't do religion in San Francisco. No one wants to do religion in San Francisco. And my joke was like, well, I don't know how to start a Jewish basketball team or do Jewish quilting. Like I'm a rabbi, like that's all I know how to do. So we started, and the people that have come to us, we're 10 years old now, are people who have married whoever they have married, or they could be 2 and 3 generations away from any normative Jewish life. So maybe there's someone who's born Jewish in the family. If anything, most people are coming from a very secular place. And I'm very surprised that they want to come and they want Shabbat. They want to study Torah. They want to ask hard questions. They want to volunteer at the local church, which has a food pantry that we're partnered with the Glide Memorial Church. And when we don't ask them at the door, who let you in, it's amazing how much they're willing to do and to show up and to participate. So it's actually entirely different from even Jewish life from the 70s and 80s in Sudbury, Massachusetts, where I'm from. It's entirely different. I look out in the community and I can't tell you who is officially Jewish. I can tell you though that with my partner, Rabbi Jessica Kate Meyer, we're converting like 20 people at any given time. So it turns out that when you allow people to come in and to try things and to get close and don't put barriers between them and the tradition, between them and holiness, many of them want more and make greater and greater commitments. So I didn't start out with this philosophy, but I haven't looked back. And I do believe it's a big piece of the future. And
Thank
you can
you,
argue
Lois.
with me. Even though I'm not your rabbi, you could argue with me too,
No, don't do that. Stan Schroeder, how are you? You're up next.
I'm fine. I couldn't also get my picture on.
You can now. There you go.
Here I go.
Here you go.
We're told that we, from Genesis, were created in God's image as human, as a people. And so we, in turn, created a God in our image, an anthropomorphic God that's in the Torah. And I can certainly, learn from that God. I can learn Torah, but I can't connect in any sense to that God in a Kabbalistic sense, like it was mentioned at the beginning. It seems that we need some other way of being more than just good, which we can learn from the Torah, but in some way holy that we can only be if, you know, if there's some other kind of connection.
Rabbi, this one's yours. Go ahead.
You actually sound like a Kabbalist to me.
I studied for a week at an institute, but I can't say that I know it, and I haven't practiced it. So, you know.
But I think you're talking about the core of that kind of a tradition, or a Hasidic tradition, or even a Midrashic tradition, which says if you read the Torah plain, there's not that much for you unless you're a child, you know, and even then it's the stories have a lot of gaps. But if you look for the nuances and the layers and you go underneath the surface of the water, as it were, there are profound connections to be had. But it does require that going underneath the surface. And being good is just the beginning of it. You know, that's something we could probably get from a lot of different places, thank God. But being holy, that's something worth aspiring to. But it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy.
Thank you.
So Stan, I was raised at a time when rabbis didn't talk about God. I know that sounds ironic, but in the 60s when I was growing up, there really wasn't there was such an embarrassment of not being able to say anything about God because we were still in the very thick of the shadow of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. And so, you had synagogues who adopted a sort of Kaplanian idea that the Jewish people is what we're going to talk about. So we talked about Jewish survival and Jewish education, the Jewish family and the state of Israel and the Shoah, anti-Semitism, but you didn't hear people talk God. And so one of the things that we have discovered and in our conversations of this series is that God is very much back in the room, very much back on the agenda. But your point is very important. We're not going to be able to talk about God in the language of previous generations. We're going to have to find, or rather, we're going to find a language from the previous generations and put its pieces together that talks about God in this moment.
Well, you know that I'm very involved in all these other things.
Yeah, no, I know that. But that really is what this moment is about. That's what this moment is about, is locating a language of divinity that really touches us, moves us, and moves us, gives us a language to transact transcendence, to talk about, to encounter transcendence, to interrogate transcendence, to figure out where we fit in the universe. We haven't found the language yet. We've only been at this for just a little while. And that's very important. And what watching it happen is one of the things that you can hear in these interviews that we did. If you listen to Tamar Elad Applebaum, I know you did, listen to Yitz Greenberg, listen to Roli Matalon, you hear some people who are really working very hard to try to discover what's the language of God that will touch the lives of this generation. My Zayda had a language for God. I mean, it worked for him and it worked for his generation. And his Zayda had a language for God and it worked for this generation. And the Rambam had a language for God that worked for nobody except the Rambam. But but what's the language for this moment? Heschel gave us some hint, some tools to find that language, but it really hasn't been found yet. Okay.
Thank you.
Elise Golden Berkeley, you're next. So,
Rabbi, as we are talking about a language, when I grew up, there were so many people, and there still are so many people that grew up at a time when there was no Israel. Today, the youth, younger kids, the millennials, Gen X, Y, Z, who knows what we're on yet, but they have grown up at a time where Israel can be easily taken for granted. And I'm very concerned about the future of Israel and the Jewish connectivity to our homeland. Last night when you spoke about Purim, and it just made me realize again how our existence, chul, outside of Israel, is never a guarantee. What language do we use? How do we reach the next generation who can take Israel for granted because they grew up at a time when there was a homeland, there was that safety net, and we live in relative peace now. So
it's a wonderful question. So I'm gonna turn it backwards on you because I love you. And here's what I'm gonna say. You know, American Jewish parents, like your parents and my parents, impressed upon us that how important Israel was. But if you remember what they said to us, they said stuff which at this moment doesn't make a lot of sense, certainly to our kids, right? Israel is a place we can run when we're in trouble. Israel is the haven. Well, that's true. But, you know, if American Jewish life becomes fraught, Israel's not going to be much safer, right? I mean, you know, and Israel became for them a cipher for, you know, all of the fear that they brought from the previous generation. What we need, and we haven't done it yet, Elise, and this is another project for another course, is a new language of our connection to the state of Israel and to the land of Israel and to the people of Israel. One of the elements of that language, and not based on fear,
right,
but based on love, but based on solidarity, but based on our aspirations and our hopes together. That's what we're looking for. But my kids will love Israel because they find there a symbol and a place and an expression of the best of their Jewish life, not a fear from previous generations that no longer really motivates them. Right. So I think that's one of the things we have to develop, in addition to Stanley's language for God, a language for a new Zionism. OK, part of what that has to be is, and this is going to bother you a little bit, but I'm going to say it anyway, is it at the same time that it has to connect your grandchildren and, God willing, one day my grandchildren to the state of Israel and the land of Israel, it also has to connect Israelis to us. It has to be a common language. They have to appreciate who we are. We are not, this is not the Golah and the Galut of David Ben-Gurion. We are not disappearing. We are not threatened by anti-Semites at every corner, right? We are a powerful, comfortable, wealthy, secure community that's creating a powerful, wealthy, secure Judaism. And there has to be a conversation back and forth. Somebody once came up with this idea, and I think it's a brilliant idea, that not only should we be sending American kids and European kids on birthright to Israel, we should be sending Israelis here. Send Israelis to pray for a couple of months in Rabbi Kushner's synagogue at the kitchen, and let them come to enjoy a different quality of Judaism that they've ever experienced before. Right? Let them come to our shul and see a different quality of Jewish life than they've ever seen before. And that the new language of Zionism isn't just a language of Zionism, but it's a language of peoplehood that connects us. And that's something we have to struggle for now too. Rabbi Kushner, what is your answer?
Just that when we have Israeli groups that come through, which when it's not COVID, we have many groups that come through, it's some of the most powerful experiences for them and for us. And it's going to connect along the lines of people around meeting activists and meeting poets and meeting rabbis. I just had the pleasure of speaking to 20 rabbis in the Tel Aviv area who are each creating startups. You know, they're learning from what we're doing. We had these beautiful kids came from Shalem, and they were so moved by what they found at the kitchen. They extended their trip and they sat in the front row of High Holidays. It was their first High Holidays, right? There are things that we can teach them about religious life that ironically they don't have. And so some of the most fruitful connections we have at the kitchen are around activists, and our friends who are activists, scholars, and for sure, religious leaders, new religious leaders. There's a whole new generation of people seeking religious life there in really interesting ways.
So when we planned this series, we carefully planned the timing so that it would end just before Purim. And so Purim calls upon us to have a little bit of fun as we end this conversation. And what we did at each lecture, if you remember, is we asked our guests for their favorite Jewish joke. And tonight, I think it would only be appropriate if Rabbi Kushner and I ended with a favorite Jewish joke. Rabbi Kushner, the floor is yours for your favorite, absolutely favorite Erev Purim Jewish joke.
This is a little early for Pesach, and it's a little off color, but I feel your group can handle it. It's my father's joke,
Please.
who's also a rabbi. He would talk about every year how at Pesach there would be two rabbis arguing, and one said to the other, you know, having matzah before the Seder, it's like sleeping with the bride before the wedding. And the other one said back to him, you know, it's not true. I've tried both. It's actually very, very different.
Oh, and I told one this afternoon to my class, so some of you heard this before, but this is, I think, really at the moment, given all the craziness in the world, my favorite Jewish joke is about Surah Fega, who was the last girl in her class to get married. Every other girl found a shidduch, every other girl found a husband, and they all got married. And Surah Fega is the very last one. And she gets married, and the week goes by, and Shabbos comes, and she's not in shul. And her friends are waiting. Where is Surah Fega? When is she coming? They wait an hour, a second hour. Finally, as the service is almost over, Surah Fega struggles into the shul and struggles up to the women's section of the shul. And her hair is a little disheveled, and her eyes are tired looking, and she's a little bit of a mess. And they say, Surah Fega, are you okay? How is married life? And she said, well, it's not what I expected. It's also a little off color. And they said, what do you mean it's not what you expected? So let me tell you what happened. Our first Shabbos last night, I did what my mama told me. I cooked a wonderful meal. I set a beautiful table with the nice dishes and the gold and silverware. And my husband, he came home from shul, and I bench licht. I lit the candles. I said the bracha. And he looked at me and he says, Surah Fega, it was a custom in my grandfather's house. As soon as my grandmother benched licht, as soon as she lit the candles, my grandfather and grandmother went upstairs, and they were like husband and wife. So we observed this custom. Upstairs we went, and for an hour we do and then we come down. I straightened the tichel, and my husband stands, and he makes the kiddush with our beautiful new silver cup. And as he sips the wine, he says, Surah Fega, it was a custom in my uncle's house that after the kiddush, it was important for my uncle and aunt to go upstairs and make like husband and wife. So upstairs we go for another hour to keep the custom of the family. And then we come down, and I straightened my tichel, and I stood at the table, and we benched on the motzi. We had a challah, beautiful challah that I baked. And my husband, he took a mouthful of challah, and he says, this reminds me that in my cousin's house, it was a custom that after the challah, upstairs they went, my cousins, and they made like husband and wife. So we have to keep the family custom, and upstairs we went for another hour, and so it was after the soup. And so it was after the chicken. And so it was after the dessert. So I'm going to tell you what married life is like. My husband, he's not a scholar. And my husband, he's not a wealthy man. And my husband's not all that good looking. But honestly, he comes from a wonderful family. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight and for this wonderful series. Thank you, Rabbi Kushner, for joining us, for sharing this wonderful journey with me. And thank you to all the members of the Kitchen San Francisco and Valley Best Shalom and Encino. Let's do this again sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Have a happy, healthy, sweet Purim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you both, Rabbi.